Preface, Crime, Its Causes and Remedies, by Cesare Lombroso, translated by Henry P. Horton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Crime, Its Causes and Remedies, by Cesare Lombroso, M.D., Professor of Psychiatry and Criminal Anthropology in the University of Turin, translated by Henry P. Horton, M.A., with an introductory by Maurice Parmelli, Ph.D., Assistant Professor of Sociology in the University of Missouri, author of Principles of Criminal Anthropology, etc. Copyright 1911 by Little Brown and Company, all rights reserved. General Introduction to the Modern Criminal Science Series. At the National Conference of Criminal Law and Criminology held in Chicago at Northwestern University in June 1909, the American Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology was organized, and, as a part of its work, the following resolution was passed. Whereas, it is exceedingly desirable that important treatises on criminology in foreign languages be made readily accessible in the English language, resolved, that the President appoint a committee of 5 with power to select such treatises as in their judgment should be translated, and to arrange for their publication. The committee appointed under this resolution has made careful investigation of the literature of the subject, as consulted by frequent correspondence. It has selected several works from among the mass of material. It has arranged with publisher, with authors, and with translators, for the immediate undertaking and rapid progress of the task. It realizes the necessity of educating the professions and the public by the wide diffusion of information on this subject. It desires here to explain the considerations which have moved it in seeking to select the treatises best adapted to the purpose. For the community at large, it is important to recognize that criminal science is a larger thing than criminal law. The legal profession, in particular, has a duty to familiarize itself with the principles of that science as its sole means for intelligent and systematic improvement of the criminal law. 2 centuries ago, while modern medical science was still young, medical practitioners proceeded upon 2 general assumptions, one as to the cause of disease, the other as to its treatment. As to the cause of disease was sent by the inscrutable will of God. No man could fathom that will, nor its arbitrary operation. As to the treatment of disease, there were believed to be a few remedial agents of universal efficacy. Calomel and bloodletting, for example, were 2 of the principal ones. A larger or smaller dose of calomel, a greater or less quantity of bloodletting, this blindly indiscriminate mode of treatment was regarded as orthodox for all common varieties of ailment. And so his calomel pill and his bloodletting lancet were carried everywhere with him by the doctor. Nowadays, all this is past in medical science. As to the cause of disease, we know that they are facts of nature, various but distinguishable by diagnosis and research, and more or less capable of prevention or control or counteraction. As to the treatment, we now know that there are various specific modes of treatment for specific causes or symptoms, and that the treatment must be adapted to the cause. In short, the individualization of disease in cause and its treatment is a dominant truth of modern medical science. The same truth is now known about crime, but the understanding and the application of it are just opening upon us. The old and still dominant thought is, as to cause, that as crime is caused by inscrutable moral free will of the human being, doing or not doing the crime just as it pleases, absolutely free in advance, at any moment in time, to choose or not to choose the criminal act, and therefore in itself the sole and ultimate cause of crime. As to treatment, there are just 2 traditional measures used in varying doses for all kinds of crime and all kinds of persons: jail or a fine, for death is now employed in rare cases only. But modern science, here as in medicine, recognizes that crime also, like disease, has natural causes. It need not be asserted for one moment that crime is a disease, but it does have natural causes, that is, circumstances which work to produce it in a given case. And as to treatment, modern science recognizes that penal or remedial treatment cannot possibly be indiscriminate and machine-like, but must be adapted to the cause and to the man as affected by those causes. Common sense and logic alike require, inevitably, that the moment we predict a specific cause for an undesirable effect, the remedial treatment must be specially adapted to that cause. Thus the great truth of the present and the future for criminal science is the individualization of penal treatment for that man and for the cause of that man's crime. Now, this truth opens up a vast field for re-examination. It means that we must study all the possible data that can be causes of crime. The man's hereditary, the man's physical and moral makeup, his emotional temperament, the surroundings of his youth, his present home and other conditions, or the influencing circumstances. And it means that the effect of different methods of treatment, old or new, for different kinds of men and of causes, must be studied, experimented, and compared. Only in this way can accurate knowledge be reached, and new efficient measures be adopted. All this has been going on in Europe for 40 years past, and in limited fields in this country. All the branches of science that can help have been working: anthropology, medicine, psychology, economics, sociology, philanthropy, penology. The law alone has abstained. The science of law is the one to be served by all this. But the public in general, and the legal profession in particular, have remained either ignorant of the entire subject or indifferent to the entire scientific movement, and the ignorance or indifference has blocked the way to progress in administration. The Institute therefore takes upon itself, as one of its aims, to inculcate the study of modern criminal science as a passing duty for the legal profession and for the thoughtful community at large. One of its principal modes of stimulating and aiding this study is to make available in the English language the most useful treatise now extant in the continental languages. Our country has started late. There is much to catch up with in the results reached elsewhere. We shall, to be sure, profit by the long period of argument and theorizing and experimentation which European thinkers and workers have passed through, but to reap that profit, the results of their experience must be made accessible in the English language. The effort in selecting this series of translations has been to choose those works which best represent the various schools of thought in criminal science, the general results reached, the points of contact or of controversy, and the contrast of method, having always in view that class of works which have a more than local value and could best be serviceable to criminal science in our country. As a science has various aspects and emphasis, the anthropological, psychological, sociological, legal, statistical, economic, pathological, due regard was paid in the selection to a representation of all these aspects. And as the several continental countries have contributed in different ways to these various aspects, France, Germany, Italy, most abundantly, but the others each share, the effort was made also to recognize the different contributions as far as feasible. The selection made by the committee, then, represents its judgment of the works that are most useful and most instructive for the purpose of translation. It is a conviction that this series, when completed, will furnish the American student of criminal science a systematic and sufficient acquaintance with the controlling doctrines and methods that now hold the stage of thought in continental Europe. Which of the various principles and methods will prove best adapted to help our problems can only be told after our students and workers have tested them in our own experience. But it is certain that we must first acquaint ourselves with these results of a generation of European thought. In closing, the committee thinks it desirable to refer the members of the Institute for purposes of further investigation of the literature to the Preliminary Bibliography of Modern Criminal Law and Criminology. Bulletin number 1 of the Gary Library of Law in Northwestern University, already issued to members of the Congress. The committee believes that some of the Anglo-American works listed therein will be found useful. Committee on Translations, Chairman John H. Wigmore, Professor of Law in Northwestern University, Chicago. Ernst Freund, Professor of Law in the University of Chicago. Maurice Parmel, Professor of Sociology in the State University of Missouri. Roscoe Pound, Professor of Law in Harvard University. Robert B. Scott, formerly Professor of Political Science in the State University of Wisconsin. W. W. Smithers, Secretary of the Comparative Law Bureau of the American Bar Association, Philadelphia, PA. Introduction to the English Version. The treatment of the criminal up to the latter part of the 19th century was dominated by the theories of the classical school of criminology. This school was based upon the thought of the 18th century philosophers. Its chief founder was the distinguished Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria. In his great work entitled Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764, he condemned the almost unlimited power which judges frequently had in determining the punishment of criminals. This power frequently led to an inhumane and unjust treatment of the criminal. Filled with a humanitarian feeling and dominated by the democratic ideas of the time, Beccaria insisted that no punishment should be greater than the crime warranted, and that all men should be equal in the eyes of the law. Thus, the fundamental principle of the classical school was that the treatment of a criminal should be determined by the character of the crime that he had committed. In each criminal case, it was to be determined what crime had been committed, and then the penalty designated by the penal code was to be applied regardless of the personality of the criminal. We can now discern many variations in the treatment of the criminal from the principle laid down by the classical school. Criminals guilty of the same crime are very frequently not subjected to the same penalty, and the variations in their treatment are not usually due to the differences in their social standing, as is frequently the case previous to the time of the classical school. The treatment of the criminal is being based more and more upon his own characteristics rather than upon the character of the crime he had committed. How has this great change come about? The largest credit for it is undoubtedly due to the great Italian criminal anthropologist Cesare Lombroso, who died in October 1909. Few men have suffered the amount of criticism and abuse that Lombroso experienced during his lifetime, but if the degree of interest and difference of opinion aroused by his ideas and the extensive literature devoted to the discussion of them are any indications of his influence, Lombroso is certainly the most important figure in criminological science since Beccaria. Let us see what were the characteristics of his teaching which gave them so great an influence. Lombroso was one of the group of great thinkers of the 19th century who had the courage and the wisdom to apply the positive inductive method of modern science to the study of human and social phenomena. He was not the first one to search for the causes of human conduct in the physiological and mental characteristics of the individual, for others, such as Galenus, Gall, and Morel, have preceded him in this study. But no one of these had carried his analysis very far, and the methods used were not always very scientific. Lombroso devoted his whole life to his study and used thoroughly inductive methods. His teachings immediately aroused great opposition, in the first place because the prejudice which existed against attributing human conduct to natural causes, but because this opposition was also due to the fact that in his first writings he attributed criminal conduct almost entirely to the characteristics of the criminal himself. That, however, he recognized later in the social cause of crime is indicated by this book, in which ample weight is given to these social causes. Lombroso commenced his studies by spending several years in studying the characteristics of the criminals in the Italian penitentiaries. In 1876, he published the first edition of his L'Uomo Delinquente. In this book, he set forth his theory that crime is caused almost entirely by the anthropological characteristics of the criminal. But in later editions of this same work, he gave more and more weight to the social causes of crime, and ultimately published the work of which the present volume is a translation. While several of his less important books have been translated into English, neither of his two principal works have ever before been translated. Thus it is that the English-speaking world is acquainted with his theories largely through hearsay. The Committee on European Translations of the American Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology has chosen the second of his great works for translation, in the belief that his theories should be better known in the country. The Institute devoted itself to the work of applying science in the administration of the criminal law, and we are glad to know that Lombroso approved of its work in the following words written shortly before his death. I beg to express my satisfaction at learning of the call for the National Conference on Criminal Law and Criminology to take place in Chicago. It will mark a new era in the progress of criminal law. If I could offer any suggestion to so competent a body of men, it would be to emphasize the importance of apportioning penalties, not according to the offense, but according to the offender. To this end, the probation system, which it is the great credit of America to have introduced, should be extended so as to suit the offender's type and individuality. It is futile to fix a term of imprisonment for the born criminal, but it is most necessary to shorten to the minimum the term for the emotional offender, and to modify it for the occasional offender, and to place the latter under the supervision of a judge, and not to let the fate be so fixed that it amounts merely to a modern form of slavery. The present volume discusses, in the main, the social causes of crime. It has seemed well to the committee that in this introduction there should be given a critical summary of Lombroso's theory as to the anthropological causes of crime, as set forth in his great work on Criminal Man. A quotation from Lombroso's opening speech at the 6th Congress of Criminal Anthropology at Turin in April 1906 will give the key to the first stage in the development of his theory. In 1870, I was carrying on for several months researches in the prisons and asylums of Pavia upon cadavers and living persons in order to determine upon substantial differences between the insane and the criminals without succeeding very well. At last I found in the skull of a brigand a very long series of atavistic anomalies, above all an enormous middle occipital fossa and a hypertrophy of the vermis, analogous to those that are found in inferior vertebrates. At the sight of these strange anomalies, the problem of the nature and of the origin of the criminals seemed to me resolved. The characteristics of primitive men and their inferior animals must be reproduced in our times. Many facts seem to confirm this hypothesis, above all the psychology of the criminal, the frequency of tattooing, and of professional slang. The passions, as much more fleeting as they are more violent, above all that of vengeance, the lack of foresight which resembles courage, and courage which alternates with cowardice, the idleness which alternates with the passion for play and activity. His first conception of the criminal, which was greatly modified later on, was, then, that the criminal is an atavistic phenomenon reproducing a type of the past. In order to find the origin of this atavistic phenomenon, he goes back not only to savage man, but also to animals and even to plants. Crime and criminals are, strictly speaking, human phenomena, and are, therefore, not to be found outside of human society. But when a criminal displays a strong tendency towards crime which results from abnormal or pathological, physiological, and psychological characteristics, it is necessary to search in the lower species for characteristics which correspond to those of the criminal. The acts which result from these characteristics Lombroso called the equivalents of crime. Among plants he finds such equivalents in the habits of the insectivorous plants. It is questionable, however, if the so-called murders of insects by these plants can be considered as equivalents of crime, since they are committed by one species against another and belong in the same category with man's habit of eating animals and plants. But among animals are to be found veritable equivalents of crime in acts contrary to the general habits and welfare of a species by one of its members. Cannibalism, infanticide, and parricide frequently occur, while murder, maltreatment, and theft are used to procure food, to secure command, and for many other reasons. In the past, the idea that crimes are committed by animals was so strong that in ancient times and in the Middle Ages animals were frequently condemned according to juridical forms or acts harmful to man. Various causes for these equivalents of crime among animals have been noted, as for example, congenital anomalies of the brain. Veterinary surgeons recognize these anomalies to give them as the causes for the misbehavior of horses. Other causes are antipathy causing murder, old age resulting in ill temper, sudden anger, physical pain, etc. Not only the equivalents of crime, but those of punishment also have been noted among the lower species. Many cases are on record of a group of animals having torn to pieces one of its members who had committed an act contrary to the welfare of the group, or had failed in performing its duties towards the group. In this blind act of vengeance we see the embryo of the form of social reaction called punishment. There are also many habits of the lowest species which, because they are natural and normal, cannot be called the equivalent of crime, but which, when reproduced among civilized men, become criminal. The same is true of many habits of savages. For example, homicide is frequently practiced under social sanction, such as infanticide, murder of the aged, of women, and of the sick, religious sacrifices, etc., while cannibalism is prevalent in many tribes. Theft also exists under social sanction, though it is not so common because the institution of private property is not highly developed among savages. The veritable crimes among savages are those against usage in which an established custom or religious rite is violated. In like manner as among the savages, characteristics are to be found in the child in a normal fashion which will be criminal in an adult, such as anger, vengeance, jealousy, lying, cruelty, lack of foresight, etc. For the first year or more of its life, a child lacks a moral standard and its development is determined largely by its surroundings. There are, furthermore, many abnormal children in whom a tendency to crime manifests itself early. It was the consideration of these facts with regard to the lower species, savages, and children which led Lombroso to formulate his first theory that crime is atavistic in its origin. This theory, as we shall see, he modified greatly later on. He discusses the atavistic origin of crime in the first part of his work and then proceeds to the study of the constitution which the criminal inherits. This we will now briefly summarize. The first series of the characteristics of the criminal is the anatomical. The study of 383 skulls of criminals gives him the results which he sums up in the following words. On considering the results that these 383 skulls give us, it is found that the lesions most frequent are great prominence of the superciliary arches, 58.2%, anomaly in the development of the wisdom teeth, 44.6%, diminution of the capacity of the skull, 32.5%, synostis of the sutures, 28.9%, retreating forehead, 28%, hyperostis of the bones, 28.9%, plagiocephaly, 23.1%, Wormian bones, 22%, simplicity of the sutures, 18.4%, prominence of the occipital protuberance, 16.6%, the middle occipital fossa, 16%, symbolic sutures, 13.6%, flattening of the occipital, 13.2%, osteophytes of the clavus, 10.1%, the incus or epileptical bone, 10.5%. A union of many of these anomalies is to be found in the same skull in a proportion of 43%, while 21% have single anomalies. But these figures would have little value if not compared with the corresponding figures for non-criminals. Such a comparison results in destroying the significance of some of these anomalies, since they prove to exist in about the same proportion among the latter. But there are others, on the contrary, which are present in a double or triple proportion in the criminals. Such are, for example, sclerosis, the epileptical bone, asymmetry, the retreating forehead, exaggeration of the frontal sinus and the superciliary arches, oxycephaly, the open intranasal structure, anomalous teeth, asymmetries of the face, and above all the middle occipital fossa among males, the fusion of the atlas and the anomalies of the occipital opening. Comparison with the skulls of the insane shows that criminals surpass the insane in most of the cranial anomalies. Comparison with savage and prehistoric skulls shows the atavistic character of some of these anomalies. Atavism, however, does not permit us to explain either the frequent obliquity of the skull and of the face, or the fusion and welding of the atlas with the occipital, or the plagiocephaly and the exaggerated sclerosis, anomalies which seem to be the result of an error in the development of the fetal skull, or a product of diseases which have slowly evolved in the nervous centers. As to the significance of the cranial anomalies, he says, "Is it possible that individuals afflicted with so great a number of alterations should have the same sentiments as men with a skull entirely normal? And note that these cranial alterations bear only upon the most visible modifications of the intellectual center, the alterations of volume and of form. A study of the convolutions of the brains of criminals reveals many anomalies, of which he says, it would be too rash to conclude that at last have been found with certainty anomalies peculiar to the cerebral circumvolutions of criminals. But it can very well be said already that in criminals these anomalies are abundant and are of two orders, some which are different from every normal type, even inferior, as the transverse grooves of the frontal lobe found by flesh in some cases, and so prominently that they do not allow the longitudinal grooves to be seen. Others are deviations from the type, but recall the type of lower animals, as the separation of the calcanean fissure from the occipital, the fissure of Sylvius which remains open, the frequent formation of an operculum of the occipital lobe. The histology of the criminal brain also shows many anomalies due in most cases to arrested development. Anomalies of the skeleton, heart, genital organs, and stomach are also noted. Then he passes to the study of the anthropometry and physiognomy of 5,907 criminals examined by himself and about a dozen other criminologists. In the anthropometric measurements it may be noted that the type usually reproduces the regional type, that they reach from fingertip to fingertip with the arms outstretched is usually superior to the height, frequent left-handedness, and prehensile foot in which the great toe is mobile, has removed an unusually long distance from the other toes, precocious wrinkles, absence of baldness, a low and narrow forehead, large jaws, etc. In the physiognomy, he discusses peculiarities of the hair, iris, ears, nose, teeth, etc., noting differences between different kinds of criminals. In general, many criminals have outstanding ears, abundant hair, a sparse beard, enormous frontal sinuses and jaws, a square and projecting chin, broad cheekbones, frequent gestures, in fact a type resembling the Mongolian and sometimes the Negro. In summarizing the anatomical study of the criminal, he says, "The study of the living, in short, confirms, although less exactly and less constantly, this frequency of microcephalies, the asymmetries of oblique orbits, of prognathisms, of frontal sinuses developed, as the anatomical table has shown us. It shows new analogies between the insane savages and criminals. The prognathism, the hair abundant, black and frizzled, the sparse beard, the skin very often brown, the oxycephaly, the oblique eyes, the small skull, the developed jaw, the zygomas, the retreating forehead, the voluminous ears, the analogy between the two sexes, a greater reach, are new characteristics added to the characteristics observed in the dead which bring the European criminals nearer to the Australian and Mongolian type, while the strabism, the cranial asymmetrics, and the serious histological anomalies, the ostomates, the meningitic lesions, the hepatic and cardiac, also show us in the criminal a man abnormal before his birth, by arrested development or by disease acquired from different organs, above all from the nervous centers, as in the insane, and make him a person who is, in truth, chronically ill. The study of the anatomical characteristics of the criminal enabled him to separate the born criminal from the criminal of habit, of passion, or of occasion who is born with very few or no abnormal characteristics. Leaving aside for the moment the latter classes of criminals, he takes up the biological and psychological characteristics of the born criminals, the first being the psychological characteristic of tattooing. One of the most characteristic traits of primitive man, or of the savage, is the facility with which he submits himself to this operation, surgical rather than aesthetic, and of which the name even has been furnished to us by the oceanic idiom. By means of the statistics of 13,566 individuals, of which 4,376 were honest, 6,347 criminal, and 2,943 insane, he shows that tattooing is quite common in some of the inferior classes of society, but is most common among criminals. It may be said that for the last, it constitutes an account of its frequency, a specific and entirely new anatomical legal characteristic. He cites many causes for tattooing, such as religion, imitation, carnal love, vengeance, idleness, vanity, and above all atavism. But the first and principal cause which has spread this custom among us is, in my opinion, atavism, or this other kind of historic atavism called tradition. Tattooing is in fact one of the essential characteristics of primitive man, and of the man who is still living in a savage state. After noting peculiarities of the molecular exchange, as indicated in the temperature, pulse, and urine, he discusses the general sensibilities of the criminal. The special taste of criminals for a painful operation so long and so full of danger as tattooing, the large number of wounds their bodies present, lead me to suspect in them a physical insensibility greater than amongst most men, an insensibility like that which is encountered in some insane persons, and especially in violent lunatics. Numerous experiments have revealed obtuseness in the sensibility of many parts of the body. Peculiarities have been noted in the visual acuteness and visual field, in the smelling, the taste, and the hearing, in the motility, in the reaction to various external influences, and the vasomotor reflexes. From all of these facts it could be deduced that nearly all the different kinds of sensibility, tactile, olfactory, and of the taste, are obtuse in the criminal, even in the occasional criminal as compared with a normal man, while in the criminal, as in the insane and hysterical, the sensibility to metals, to the magnet, and to the atmosphere is exaggerated. Their physical insensibility recalls quite forcibly that of savage peoples who can face, in the initiations of puberty, tortures which a man of the white race could never endure. From this study showing the marked analgesia of the criminal, he passes to his affective sensibility. In general, the criminal man, the moral insensibility, is as great as the physical insensibility. Undoubtedly, the one is the effect of the other. It is not that in him the voice of sentiment is entirely silent, as some literally men of inferior ability suppose, but it is certain that the passions which make the heart of the normal man beat with the greatest force are very feeble in him. The first sentiment which is extinguished in these beings is that of pity for the suffering of another, and this happens just because they themselves are insensible to suffering. Then he discusses various psychological characteristics of the criminal, showing his instability, vanity, lasciviousness, laziness, lack of foresight, etc. He shows that his intelligence varies greatly among the different classes of criminals. He discusses at some length the argot, or professional slang of criminals. Atavism contributes more to this than any other thing. They talk differently from us because they do not feel in the same way. They talk like savages because they are veritable savages in the midst of this brilliant European civilization. In a similar manner, he studies the hieroglyphics, writing, and literature of criminals. In the first volume of this work, Lombroso describes the characteristics of the born criminal, who, as we shall see, he believes represents a distinct anthropological type. In the second volume, he takes up first certain analogies which he believes exist between the born criminal and certain other abnormal types, and then deals with the other classes of criminals. At first, he deals with the analogy and indeed the identity which he believes exists between congenital criminality and moral insanity. The characteristics of the born criminal that we have studied in the first volume are the same as those of the moral imbecile. Under the name of moral imbecility, psychiatrists have classified the insane, whose most prominent pathological characteristic is a complete or almost complete absence of moral feeling and of moral ideas. The famous English alienist Henry Maudsley has described this class in the following words: "Notwithstanding prejudices to the contrary, there is a disorder of the mind, which without illusion, delusion, or hallucination, the symptoms are mainly exhibited in a perversion of those mental faculties which are usually called the active and moral powers, the feeling, affection, propensities, temper, habits, and conduct. The affective life of the individual is profoundly deranged, and his derangement shows itself in what he feels, desires, and does. He has no capacity of true moral feeling. All his impulses and desires, to which he yields without check, are egotistic. His conduct appears to be governed by immoral motives, which are cherished and obeyed without any evident desire to resist them. There is an amazing moral insensibility, the intelligence often acute enough being not affected otherwise than in being tainted by the morbid feeling under the influence of which the persons think and act. Indeed, they often display an extraordinary ingenuity in explaining, excusing, or justifying their behaviour, exaggerating this, ignoring that, and so coming the whole as to make themselves appear the victims of misrepresentation and persecution. Such a person may very easily become a criminal. A person who has no moral sense is naturally well fitted to become a criminal, and if his intellect is not strong enough to convince him that crime will not in the end succeed, and that it is, therefore, to the lowest grounds of folly, he is very likely to become one. Moral insanity may be caused by various abnormal or pathological mental characteristics, congenital or acquired in the individual. Whenever one of these characteristics destroys the capacity for moral feeling and for comprehending moral ideas, the individual becomes a moral imbecile. Moral insanity, therefore, is not a morbid entity in the sense that it arises out of one pathological mental characteristic or state of mind. It is, on the contrary, as Bayer has said, a symptom common to various cerebral diseases. Lombroso, however, apparently regarded it as such an entity, for he frequently spoke of it as if it were a distinct disease, and furthermore he identified it with the born criminal who he considered a distinct type. He cites a good deal of evidence in support of this identification. One of the things which prove directly the identity of moral insanity and of crime, and which at the same time explains to us the doubts with which the alienists have been possessed up to this day, is the extreme rarity of the first in the insane asylums, and its great frequency, on the contrary, in the prisons. After supporting this statement with statistics, he demonstrates many likenesses between the moral imbecile and the born criminal, with regard to the weight, the skull, the physiognomy, the analgesia, tactile, sensibility, tattooing, vascular reaction, affectability, etc. By contending that there is an identity between the moral imbecile and the born criminal, It does not, however, mean that every moral imbecile is a criminal. For that matter, not every person born with a criminal temperament becomes a criminal, for external circumstances may resist and overcome the innate criminal tendencies. But he believes that in physical constitution and mental characteristics, the two are fundamentally alike. This identity of the moral imbecile with the born criminal is, he believes, still more conclusively proved by a similar likeness which he finds between the criminal and the epileptic. The objection has justly been made against this fusion that the cases of true moral insanity that I have been able to study are too restrictive in number. That is true, but is after all very natural, for precisely because moral imbeciles are born criminals, they are not found as frequently in the asylum as in the prison, and it is also for that reason that it is not easy to establish a comparison. But there exists in epilepsy a uniting bond, much more important, much more comprehensible, which can be studied upon a great scale, that unites and bases the moral imbecile and the born criminal in the same natural family. As in the case of the analogy between the moral imbecile and the born criminal, he demonstrates many likenesses between the epileptic and the born criminal, in height, weight, the brain, the skull, the physiognomy, the flat and prehensile foot, the sensibility, the visual field, motility, tattooing, etc. Criminality is therefore an atavistic phenomenon which is provoked by morbid causes, of which the fundamental manifestation is epilepsy. It is very true that criminality can be provoked by other diseases, hysteria, alcoholism, paralysis, insanity, neurasthenia, etc., but it is epilepsy which gives to it, by its frequency, by its gravity, the most extended basis. But while all born criminals are epileptics, according to Lombroso, not all epileptics are born criminals. In all three, congenital criminality, moral insanity, and epilepsy, we find the irresistible force which results in crime or similar irresponsible acts. The perversion of the affective sphere, the hate exaggerated and without motive, the absence or insufficiency of all restraint, the multiple hereditary tendencies are the source of irresistible impulses in the moral imbecile, as well as in the born criminal and the epileptic. These two analogies between the born criminal and the moral imbecile and the epileptic mark the second stage in the development of his theory. The studies which form the first part of this volume accord admirably with those which have been developed in the second and third parts of the first volume to make us see in the criminal a savage and at the same time a sick man. In other words, he no longer sees in the born criminal only an atavistic return to the savage, but also arrested development and disease, thus making the born criminal both an atavistic and a degenerate phenomenon. He now passes to the treatment of the classes of criminals other than the born criminal. The first of these is the criminal by passion. Among the criminals there is a category which is distinguished absolutely from all others. It is this of the criminals by passion, who ought rather to be called criminals by violence, because as we have seen, and as we shall see better still in their etiology, all these crimes have for substratum the violence of some passion. These criminals are quite rare, are usually young, have few anomalies of the skull, a good physiognomy, honesty of character, exaggerated affectabilities oppose the apathy of the born criminal, and frequent repentance after the crime, sometimes followed by suicide or reformation in prison. A larger percentage of them are women than among other criminals. The passions which excite these criminals are not those which rise gradually in the organism, as avarice and ambition, but those which burst forth unexpectedly, as anger, platonic, or filial love, offended honour, which are usually generous passions, and often sublime. On the other hand, those which predominate in ordinary criminals are the most ignoble and the most ferocious, as vengeance, cupidity, carnal love, and drunkenness. But in them, as in ordinary criminals, are found sometimes traces of epilepsy and impulsive insanity, shown by the impetuosity, suddenness, and ferocity of their crimes. The frequency of suicide among criminals by passion also indicates a pathological state of mind. A special kind of criminal by passion is a political criminal. In nearly all political criminals by passion, we have noticed an exaggerated sensibility, a veritable hyperesthesia, as in the ordinary criminals by passion, but a powerful intellect, a great altruism pushed them towards ends much higher than those of the latter. There is never wealth, vanity, the smile of woman, even though often eroticism is not lacking in them, as in Garibaldi, Mazzini, Cavour. which impel them, but rather the great patriotic religious scientific ideas. Statistics show a much higher proportion than the average of insane persons among criminals, and therefore Lombroso deals next with insane criminals as a special class of criminals. A study made upon 100 insane criminals, chosen by preference from those who had become insane before the crime, with the exception of the epileptics, has shown to me the frequency of the criminal type, that is to say, the presence of 5 or 6 characteristics of degeneracy, and especially outstanding ears, or allels anans, frontal sinuses, a voluminous jaw and zygoma, a ferocious look or strabism, thin upper lip, in the proportion of 44%. This fact, however, does not lead him to identify the insane criminal with the born criminal, but he finds numerous analogies between the two in the weight, height, skull, tattooing, etc., and also many psychological analogies in the manner of committing a crime. He connects certain kinds of crime with certain kinds of insanity. I've just mentioned the existence of certain kinds of insanity which reproduce each of the subspecies of criminality, so that to the judicial figure of incendiarism or of homicide can be opposed the psychiatric figure of pyromania, homicidal monomania, paradoxical sexuality, etc. Thus he opposes to the judicial figure of theft the psychiatric figure of kleptomania, to habitual drunkenness, dipsomania, to rape and bedestry, sexual inversion, to crimes of lust, satyriasis and nymphomania, to idleness and vagabondage, to neurasthenia. He then discusses the psychological differences between the born criminal and the insane criminal with respect to the different kinds of mental maladies and to the differences in motives for crimes and the manner of committing them. He finishes the study of the insane criminal with a study of 3 special kinds: the alcoholic criminal, the hysterical criminal, and the criminal matoid. The last part of his work is devoted to the occasional criminal. Of this study he says, "If I have been forced to delay for several years the publication of this book, it has been on account of this part in particular, for although in possession of numerous documents, direct contact with the facts failed me in the measure that I was trying to approach myself to them. The abundance of the facts also, their excessive variety, constituted for me a cause of uncertainty which prevented me from reaching a conclusion." The first group with which he deals is that of the persuaded criminals. These criminals are those who commit crimes involuntarily, who commit acts which are not perverse or prejudicial to society, but which are called crimes by the law, who commit crimes under very extraordinary circumstances, such as in defense of the person, of honor, or the substance of the family. These crimes are rather judicial than real, because they are created by imperfections of the law rather than by those of men. They do not awaken any fear for the future, and do not disturb the moral sense of the masses. The next group is that of the criminaloids. Here, the accident, the all-powerful occasion, draws only those who are already somewhat predisposed to evil. The occasions out of which these crimes arise are the temptation to imitate, the constant opportunities offered by the commercial profession for fraud, abuse of confidence, etc., the associations of the prison, a passion less intense than the criminal by passion which draws the honest man slowly to crime, the criminal couple, the stronger member of which, having evil tendencies, perverts the weaker, epidemic, allurement, etc. These are individuals who constitute the gradations between the born criminal and the honest man, or better still, a variety of born criminal who has indeed a special organic tendency, but one which is less intense, who has therefore only a touch of degeneracy. That is why I will call them criminaloids. But it is natural that in them the importance of the occasion determining the crime should be decisive, while it is not so for the born criminal, for whom it is a circumstance with which he can dispense, and with which he often does dispense, as for example in case of brutal mischievousness. This position of the criminaloid between the born criminal and the honest man is in harmony with all natural phenomena, while the most striking phenomena are in continuity with a series of analogous phenomena less accentuated, just as in the moral sphere we have genius, talent, intelligence, etc., and the pathology of degeneracy, the cretin, the cretinous, the subcretin, the idiot, the matoid, the imbecile, etc. The third group of occasional criminals is that of the habitual criminal. The greatest number of these individuals is furnished by those who, normal from birth and without tendencies for a peculiar constitution for crime, not having found in the early education of parents, schools, etc., This force which provokes, or better said, facilitates the passage from the physiological community, which we have seen belongs properly to an early age, to a normal honest life, fall continually lower into the primitive tendency towards evil. So that these individuals without an abnormal hereditary are led not by one circumstance offering the occasion for crime, but by a group of circumstances conditioning their early life into a career of crime. Associations of criminals, such as those of brigands, mafia, and camorra in Italy, and the Black Hand in Spain, etc., contain many members drawn to crime by their associates. In the classes in which, on account of wealth, power, etc., their conditions are against the commission of crime, the criminal tendencies of those born with such tendencies remain latent or manifest themselves in other ways. Finally, there is a class of epileptoids in whom there is a substratum of epilepsy which sometimes forms a basis for the development of criminal tendencies. In the first edition of his work, Lombroso gave excessive weight to the anatomical and anthropometric data, which was not very surprising, since they were the most obvious and the most easily obtainable. The excessive emphasis laid upon the anatomical characteristics of the criminal led him to distinguish but one type, the criminal as an atavistic phenomenon. This immediately called forth the charge of unilaterality. The idea still exists that Lombroso recognized but one type of criminal who is a result of a single cause, namely atavism. But the brief summary of his work which I have so far given is sufficient to disprove this. We have seen that in addition to studying the anatomical characteristics of the criminal, he makes a lengthy study of his biological and psychological characteristics as well. In the latter editions of his work, he rejected in part the atavistic theory of crime, no longer considering atavism as the only cause of crime, and adopted the theory of degeneracy as one of its causes. In this edition, I have demonstrated that in addition to the characteristics truly atavistic, there are acquired and entirely pathological characteristics. Facial asymmetry, for example, which does not exist in the savage, strabism, inequality of the ears, dyschromatopsy, unilateral paresia, irresistible impulses, the need of doing evil for the sake of evil, etc., and the sinister gaiety which is noticeable in the professional slang of criminals, and which, alternating with a certain religiousness, is found so often in epileptics. There be added meningitis and softening of the brain, which certainly do not result from atavism. In his studies on moral imbecility and epilepsy, he has demonstrated the analogies between these two and congenital criminality. Though his identification of the moral imbecile with the born criminal and of the born criminal with the epileptic may be disproved, his demonstration of the pathological likeness of the three to each other is incontestable. In his study of the insane criminal, he has exposed the characteristics of another very abnormal criminal type. He has demonstrated the abnormality of certain of the criminals by passion. In the criminaloid he has shown a criminal partially abnormal, who, however, will not commit a crime until a good opportunity presents itself. The habitual criminal, though born without criminal tendencies, has then developed in him by the circumstances of his early life. Finally, in some of the criminals by passion, and the pseudo criminal, we find entirely normal persons who have committed crimes under very exceptional circumstances. Thus we see how very synthetic in his study of the characteristics of the criminal, since it ranges from the most abnormal to the perfectly normal, and then borders upon the study of the social causes of crime, which he takes up at great length in the work which the present volume is a translation. The theory which is most closely connected with the name of Lombroso is that of the criminal anthropological type. That is to say, his theory that there is an anthropological type which corresponds to habitual criminal conduct. This has been the most contested idea in criminal anthropology and the one that has received the largest amount of discussion in books, congresses, etc. Though this idea of a criminal type has been suggested several times in the past, it was fully developed for the first time by Lombroso. We have already surmised his conception of the born criminal who constitutes for him a distinct criminal type. A quotation from his speech at the Congress of Criminal Anthropology at Turin in 1906 has shown that his early studies led him to regard the criminal as an atavistic type, as reproducing the characteristics of lower races and species. This theory, offered in his early works as an explanation of the congenital criminal tendencies, was severely attacked on account of its unilaterality. These criticisms and his further researches led him, as we have seen, to modify his theory and to recognize degeneracy as the cause of congenital criminality. He even came to regard atavism as a form of degeneracy, as where he speaks of the criminal type as the presence of 5 or 6 characteristics of degeneracy, and especially outstanding ears, orales and hounds, frontal sinuses, jaw, and zygomos voluminous, a ferocious look or strabism, thin upper lip. This recognition of degeneracy as a cause of crime has made Lombroso's doctrine more catholic, so that it is much easier to connect the criminal with the social and physical conditions out of which he has evolved. But it is questionable, as we shall see, whether degeneracy can be regarded as a form of atavism. In order to make more distinct his conception of the criminal type, he discusses the character of a type in general as follows. In my opinion, one should receive the type with the same reserve the one he uses in estimating the value of averages in statistics. When one says that the average life is 32 years and the most fateful month is December, no one understands by that everybody must die at 32 years and in the month of December. The type is, therefore, an abstract conception including the characteristics which are most common in a certain group of individuals. But this does not mean that every individual in the group must have all these characteristics, as Isidore G. Saint-Hilaire has said. The type is a sort of fixed point and common center about which the differences presented are like so many deviations in different directions and oscillations, varied almost indefinitely, about which nature seems to play, as the anatomists used to say. Applying this general conception of a type, it is evident that every criminal representing this type need not have all its characteristics. In fact, it is doubtful if any one criminal ever did have all these characteristics. Furthermore, he discusses what percentage of criminals represent the criminal type. This number he places at about 40%. The objection has been made that it is impossible to talk about a criminal type when 60% of the criminals do not represent it, to which he replies as follows. But in addition to the fact that the vigor of 40% is not to be disdained, the insensible passage from one character to another manifests itself in all organic beings. It manifests itself even from one species to another. With more reason, it is so in the anthropological field, where the individual variability, increasing in direct proportion to improvement and to civilization, seems to efface the complete type. We can give no more space to this summary of Lombroso's theory, but must now make certain comments and criticisms. Strange to say, Lombroso seems to have been somewhat ignorant of biology, and especially the theory of heredity. This is indicated, for example, by the loose way in which he uses the term atavism. It is true that biologists recognize that atavism, or reversion, as they usually call it, takes place when there reappear individual of the present day characteristics of an earlier type, if this reappearance is a result of hereditary forces. That is to say, if earlier characteristics which have long remained dormant reassert themselves in the germ plasm at the time of conception, there is a true case of reversion. But it is very evident that many of the criminal characteristics which Lombroso calls atavistic are not hereditary in their origin, but are the causes of arrested development, either before or after birth. This is the case when he speaks of degeneracy as a form of atavism, for it is very evident that most, if not all, the characteristics he has in mind are not congenital. The fact that the individual has them at birth does not indicate necessarily that they are congenital, for they may be the result of arrested development during the antenatal period of the life of the individual. In other causes, he calls characteristics atavistic, which are simply habits which have been transmitted by social means. For example, he seems to regard the habit of tattooing as an atavistic trait, but tattooing is no more than a habit which could not possibly be transmitted by hereditary means. This indicates that Lombroso may have believed in the hereditary transmission of acquired characteristics, though he nowhere explicitly states his opinion as to this point. But he again and again speaks as if habits, or the effects of habits, are transmitted by hereditary means. The consensus of opinion of biologists today is that no acquired characteristics can be transmitted by hereditary means. Therefore, Lombroso was very much in error in this respect. Lombroso believed that there is a criminal anthropological type, or rather there are several such types which correspond to habitual modes of criminal conduct. Here again he seems to be holding the belief that acquired characteristics are inheritable, for otherwise it is conceivable that any anthropological type necessarily possesses certain habits. Such a type may possess congenital tendencies which make him more likely to acquire certain habits, but this is not necessarily the case. It is true that Lombroso recognized that environmental forces might prevent the individual from expressing these inborn tendencies to certain kinds of action and acts. But he laid too much emphasis upon the extent to which the habits of a person are determined by hereditary forces. But whatever may have been his faults, Lombroso was a great pioneer whose original and versatile genius and aggressive personality led to the great movement towards the application of the positive, inductive methods of modern science to the problem of crime, and who stimulated, more than any other man, the development of the new science of criminology. The breadth of his treatment of the subject of crime is nowhere illustrated better than the present volume, in which a large number of the complex causes of crime are discussed. It is therefore to be hoped that through this volume the English-speaking world will acquire an adequate idea of his genius and the great services he rendered to the study and treatment of crime. Maurice Barmel. The Author's Preface. To Max Nordau. To you, as the ablest and best beloved of my brothers in arms, I dedicate this book. In it I attempt by means of facts to answer those who, not having read my Criminal Man, of which it is the necessary complement, nor the works of Pellman, Kurella, Van Hamel, Salilis, Ellis, Bleuler, and others, accuse my school of having neglected the economic and social causes of crime, and having confined itself to the study of the born criminal, thus teaching that the criminal is riveted irrevocably to his destiny, that humanity has no escape from his atavistic ferocity. Now, if this charge were true, the unfortunate nature of the facts revealed could not be urged against the school which discovered them. But the truth is that, while the old jurists had nothing to propose for the prevention of crime more efficacious than the cruel and sterile empiricism of the prison and deportation system, and while the most practical peoples have arrived at good results, only sporadically, and as a chance outcome of unsystematic groupings, my school has devised a new strategic method of proceeding against crime, based upon a study of its etiology and nature. In the first place, the distinction which we have made between the criminaloid, the occasional criminal, the criminal by passion, and the born criminal, as well as the study of the more important classes of crime, enables us to determine with precision the individuals to whom we can apply our curative processes, and the method appropriate to each case. With the born criminal, to be sure, only a palliative treatment is possible. This is what I have called a symbiosis, the attempt to utilize a criminal's evil propensities by diverting the course of the criminal instinct. The measure for the attainment of this object, however, can only be individual. But with criminaloids, whose evil propensities are not so deep-seated, we may often hope for better results. Here again it is necessary to commence the treatment in early youth by what I should call moral nurture, which would withdraw the young criminals from the influence of depraved parents and from that of the streets, and place them on farms in the colonies. In this matter legislation and social influences are of great importance. Thus emigration from overpopulated countries towards those less thickly settled wards off one of the worst influences, that of a dense population, divorced parents, adulteries, poisonings, etc., or the war made upon drunkenness by religious associations and temperance societies, and through the enforcement of penalties, prevents much brawling and violence. All this has been established by statistics. These directly preventive measures, it is true, do not always suffice. Since it is a need of cerebral stimulation that leads men to drink, and since this need grows with the progress of civilization, it is necessary to get at the root of the evil, and satisfy this need by means less dangerous than drink, such as shows, coffee rooms, etc. But here another difficulty arises, namely, that nearly all the physical and moral causes of crime present a double aspect, often contradictory. Thus there are crimes which are favoured by density of population, like rebellion, and others, like brigandage and homicide, which are occasioned by sparseness of population. So also while there are crimes caused by poverty, there are almost as many which are encouraged by extreme wealth. The same contradiction is observed when we pass from one country to another. Thus when homicide decreases in Italy with the increase of population and wealth, in France this crime increases with the increase of these two factors, a fact which is to be explained by the great influence of alcoholism and of foreign immigration. Religion, which among Protestants appears to prevent many crimes, in many Catholic countries multiplies them, or at least fails to prevent their increase. and if education appears to be useful in preventing homicide, theft, assault, etc., it is very often, when too advanced, seems to encourage fraud, false testimony, and political crime. Difficulty is increased still more by the fact that, even if we find effective methods of combating the influence of environment, it is not easy to apply them. It is possible, for example, to counteract the effect of heat upon the frequency of crimes of violence and immorality by means of cold baths, but it is not easy to bring a whole section of the people to the bathhouses or to the sea, as was done in ancient Rome, and as the practice still is in Calabria. The statesman, then, who wishes to prevent crime ought to be eclectic and not limit himself to a single course of action. He must guard against the dangerous effects of wealth no less than against those of poverty, against the corrupting influence of education not less than against that of ignorance. In this labyrinth of contradictions, the only safe guide is the study of the criminal combined with the study of the etiology of crime. From all this we can understand the uncertainty and embarrassment to which these contradictions expose our public officials, and can see why men whose trade is law-making find that the most obvious recourse is the modification of a few pages of a penal code. This is why the prison, the worst of all remedies, if we can call it a remedy at all and not a poison, will always be applied to the simplest and most practical means of safety. It has antiquity and custom on its side, and these are points of great importance for the ordinary man. He finds it easier always to apply the same remedy than to find a number of different remedies suited to differences of age, sex, and education. I have traced above only the outlines of the system of criminal therapeutics which I intend to set forth in this book. But to tell the truth, it is not a system that is entirely new. It has been stated that certain practical nations, less smothered than our own under a too glorious past, and for that reason less infatuated with the ancient codes, have already here and there arrived empirically without knowing a word of criminal anthropology at several of the reforms that I shall suggest. The asylum for the criminal insane, the truant schools, the ragged schools, the societies for the protection of children, and the asylums for alcoholics are institutions which, without being a part of the criminal code, have been applied more or less completely in North America, England, and Switzerland. For these are happy countries where religion is less a mass of dogmas and rites than an ardent war against crime, so in these lands, and especially in London itself, where wealth, density, and immigration would naturally favour crime, the conquering march of criminality has been checked. These attempts, however, being partial, scattered, and without contradiction, lack the effectiveness in the eyes of the world which proceeds from a complete demonstration, at once theoretical and practical. Yet they have a great value, because practical applications always precede and prepare for a scientific codification, and also because, for timid spirits, they give to our reforms the most convincing sanction, that of experience. What now lies before us is to complete and systematize these reforms in a final way, in accordance with the data of biology and sociology. It is this that I intend to do in this book. Cesare Lombroso, Turin, 1906. Translator's note. While the present work is based upon Professor Lombroso's French version, the German translation of Dr. Kurella and Dr. Jensch have been found a valuable commentary upon certain passages, and has been followed in the omission of some few notes and other details interesting to Italians only. The French work was published in Paris in 1899, and appears to have been embodied by the author in his L'Uomo delinquente, as the third volume in its latest Italian edition. The German translation was published in 1902. Henry P. Horton, Columbia, Missouri, November 1910. End of Preface.